Have you ever had painful muscle cramps after completing a strenuous exercise? Why does this happen?
Lesson is on anaerobic respiration, which is respiration in the absence of oxygen. So occasionally there are situations where oxygen is not available at the final to be the final electron receptor for the electron transport chain in an anoxic environment. So again, the absence of oxygen. So other molecules must be used. And anaerobic respiration is not at all efficient as aerobic respiration. So organisms that will always live in an anoxic environment typically use inorganic chemicals such as sulfate, nitrate, and carbon dioxide as electron acceptors, but less ATP is produced overall. So, in aerobic cellular respiration, this is an oxidation reaction where electrons are lost. So, we transfer electrons from high energy molecules to oxygen. Most of the energy in plants, animals, and other eukaryotes, which are cells that have nucleuses, are produced through aerobic respiration. And it starts with glycolysis in the cell, in the fluid of the cell in the cytoplasm, and an anaerobic reaction in the glucose is an anaerobic reaction in the cytoplasm or anaerobic respiration simply due to the presence of oxygen. So aerobic respiration down the center in blue occurs in the presence of oxygen, where both lactate fermentation on the left with green and alcohol fermentation on the right with red are both occurring in the absence of oxygen. So the final byproducts of anaerobic respiration are sulfur, nitrate, nitrogen, and methane, which are bacteria that live in the large intestines of an anaerobic environment. So we have a lot of methane gas produced during anaerobic respiration. Fermentation is the metabolic pathway to produce ATP when organisms lack oxygen. So this produces only the ATP that's generated during glycolysis, so much less efficient than aerobic respiration. So many single cell bacteria carry out fermentation, as well as yeast. And fermentation can also occur deep within tissues that are not near an oxygen source, such as submerged plant tissues or muscle cells. And there are two different types of fermentation. One is lactate fermentation, and this occurs in muscle cells that are temporarily without oxygen and they carry out lactate fermentation. This converts pyruvate to a molecule called lactate or lactic acid, which is then stored in the muscle tissue and it causes stiffness and soreness. When the oxygen content is increased, the lactate is then converted to pyruvate, which continues on in the Krebs cycle of the aerobic pathway. So in lactate fermentation, only glycolysis occurs and no Krebs cycle occurs. And we have a net of 2 ATP, so way less than the entire Krebs cycle. In ethanol fermentation, some organisms can function both aerobically and anaerobically. And when they function anaerobically, they carry out ethanol fermentation, which produces carbon dioxide and alcohol. There are two steps to this process. One of them, after glycolysis, produces pyruvate, which then turns into ethanol. The pyruvate is converted into 2-carbon compound by the release of carbon dioxide. So the pyruvate went from a 3-carbon compound to a 2-carbon compound, and carbon dioxide was released. That 2-carbon compound is then reduced by NADH to form ethanol. So it gains electrons and forms ethanol. So again, only glycolysis, no Krebs cycle, and a net of 2 ATP. So here's our fermentation pathways. We have our 2-pyruvic acid. We can either produce lactic acid or ethanol fermentation. Carbon dioxide is produced, and a 2 ATP in the glycolysis cycle. So during World War I, large amounts of butanol and acetone were needed, and these were previously attained by burning wood in the absence of oxygen, but the yield was really low, about 100 to 1 in volume. So scientists discovered that the fermentation pathways could convert molasses or grain to butanol and acetone with yields of 100 to 24 and 100 to 12 respectively, so much more effective. And the process of fermentation produces large amounts of ethanol, which humans long ago learned could be burned, and it's produced on a large scale to add to our fuel sources. So in Canada, we have about 10% of ethanol is in our gasoline, and commonly produced from corn or wheat. So the starches convert in corn or wheat. The starch is converted to glucose by enzymes, which then yeast is used to anaerobically produce the ethanol. This can be distilled, producing almost pure ethanol, which does result in carbon dioxide. However, this produces less carbon monoxide and other volatile organic compounds that contribute to smog. So it is a cleaner fuel than straight gasoline. Manure from pigs and cattle can be captured and stored in an oxygen-free container, allowing it to decompose in the presence of anaerobic bacteria, and this produces methane and carbon dioxide. The methane can then be burned to produce heat, light, or electricity. One family of 4 to 6 individuals could use the manure from 5 pigs for their daily needs of heating rather than 11 kilograms of propane. But wait, what about that pesky carbon dioxide? So, the advantage of burning manure is that the carbon that is created from the fermentation is recycled from the glucose from the plants. Therefore, we consider it to be carbon neutral. Because the plants were growing recently and then the manure was produced recently. But when we're burning fossil fuels, we're releasing carbon that's been stored for millions and millions of years after being taken out of circulation. So we're taking carbon from a carbon sink and putting it into the atmosphere versus keeping fast cycling carbon from the plant and animal cycles and burning that for fuel. So the large amounts that are being released over a short period of time in fossil fuel combustion are concentrating it in the environment more than any other time in history. And it's causing some pretty serious environmental effects. Thanks for joining me today to learn about anaerobic respiration. Take care.